It was a crisp Monday morning, the kind that carried the scent of fresh starts and quiet ambition. Jasmine Porter, just 14 years old, stood outside Oakdee Bank, her fingers clutching a navy folder with more weight than its contents suggested. Dressed in her school uniform blazer, neat shoes polished her dark curls, pinned back, she looked every bit the determined student she was. But beneath that composed exterior, her heart raced. This was more than a simple bank visit. It was her first solo financial transaction, and in her hands was a $5,000 academic scholarship check, money she had earned through disciplined sleepless nights and unmatched resolve. Jasmine inhaled deeply. Her mother had offered to come, of course, but Jasmine had refused. She wanted this to be hers, her responsibility, her proof of maturity. The check wasn't just a reward. It was a milestone, a marker of independence. She had won that scholarship not because of who her mother was, but because of who she was. Jasmine knew she could handle this, or at least she believed she could. The bank lobby gleamed with elegance, polished marble floors, brass light fixtures, and quiet jazz drifting through the air. It all felt intimidating but exciting. She walked with careful steps toward the teller counter where a young man with a bored expression glanced up at her. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her folder, revealing the check and a collection of documents, school ID award letter, even a copy of her student transcript. She had come prepared. Behind the counter, unnoticed at first, stood a woman watching from the glass-walled office, Victoria Hayes. Impeccably dressed around her late 40s, Victoria had the kind of posture and expression that made people sit straighter. The moment her eyes landed on Jasmine, they narrowed ever so slightly. She stepped closer to the counter just as Jasmine handed over her documents. Tom, the teller, held the check to the light, squinting, as if searching for invisible ink. His eyebrows crept upward. $5,000, he asked, doubt curling in his voice. Yes, Jasmine replied, steadying herself. It's my academic scholarship. She offered a soft smile, hoping to meet kindness with clarity. I have all the paperwork right here. Victoria's shoes clicked against the marble as she approached, her expression unreadable. Her eyes scanned the check, the ID, the girl, and then her lips tightened into a thin line. We've had issues with fraudulent checks lately, she said, just loud enough for other patrons to overhear. We'll need to verify everything before we can process it. Jasmine's smile faltered. Of course. I understand. But something in the way Victoria looked at her felt off, not professional caution, but a deeper, colder scrutiny. The kind that isn't about the money or the procedure, but about the person. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the folder, her confidence wavered for the first time. The teller hesitated, then looked to Victoria for silent approval. Without waiting, Victoria took the documents and turned away. I need to call my mom, Jasmine said quietly, her voice catching. She's expecting me home soon. I left my phone in my locker at school. Victoria stopped mid-step. That's not our concern, she snapped without turning. You'll wait until we finish our verification process. The words hung in the air like frost. Jasmine stood, rooted suddenly, unsure of what to do. Around her, the bank resumed its gentle rhythm. People chatting, phones ringing, papers rustling. But for her, everything had shifted. She was no longer a customer with a legitimate check. She was an anomaly, a disruption, an unwelcome presence. She looked down at her uniform, at the name tag on her blazer, and reminded herself who she was. Jasmine Porter, scholarship winner, honor student, daughter of Dr. Naomi Porter. But in this place, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She straightened her shoulders and stayed silent. She would wait, but something deep inside her was beginning to burn. Jasmine shifted her weight from foot to foot, her legs starting to ache as the minutes dragged on. She stood near the counter, awkward and out of place, while the hum of business carried on around her, tellers calling out names, customers exchanging pleasantries, the occasional laugh cutting through the tension in her chest like a cruel reminder of the normalcy she was denied. She tried not to fidget, tried to look composed. But inside she was unraveling. From across the counter, Victoria Hayes watched with a cool detachment. The manager's expression remained unreadable, but her body language told a story. Arms crossed, head tilted ever so slightly, eyes narrowed with quiet judgment. She hadn't made any move to verify Jasmine's documents. She hadn't picked up the phone or typed a single word into her terminal. Instead, she simply stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting the silence hum with suspicion. Finally, Victoria spoke not to Jasmine, but to the teller Tom, in a voice loud enough to be heard by others nearby. "We've had a lot of students try to pass fake awards through here lately," she said. "You can never be too careful." Jasmine's ears rang with the sting of those words. Her jaw clenched. She wanted to shout that she wasn't like those students, that this was real, that she had worked so hard for this moment. But her father's voice echoed in her mind, calm and firm. "In tense moments, composure is your power." So she breathed. "I've provided everything you asked for," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor threatening to rise in her throat. "ID, the scholarship letter, even the contact information for my school. It's all in the folder." Tom looked to Victoria again, uncertain. Victoria's response was dismissive. "We'll get to it when we can. In the meantime, have her wait." She didn't even look at Jasmine when she said it. Jasmine blinked, startled. "Wait where? Over there." Victoria gestured vaguely toward a corner of the lobby, away from the counter. The implication was clear. Out of the way. As if she were clutter, an inconvenience. With slow steps, Jasmine moved to the corner, clutching her folder against her chest like armor. The floor beneath her polished shoes felt colder now, harder. The walls taller, the ceiling further away. She glanced at the other customers, some giving her puzzled glances, others offering nothing but pointed indifference. She had never felt so small. From her new vantage point, she could still hear murmurs from the staff. Tom and Victoria were talking again, their voices just low enough to blur together. But then a phrase cut through. For someone her age, with that amount, Jasmine's stomach twisted. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, her knuckles pale from the pressure of holding onto the folder. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had imagined walking in, presenting her documents, making her deposit, and walking out with her head held high. She hadn't expected to be questioned, doubted, and isolated like this. And it wasn't just the procedure. It was her. It was the way they looked at her, the way they didn't look at her, like she was a problem to solve, not a person to respect. The minutes passed like hours. No one came over, no one offered an update or even a glass of water. She was left standing cold and alone as the business of the bank continued without her. She looked toward Victoria, who had now moved behind the teller line, speaking with another employee. Her demeanor was casual, even cheerful, laughing softly at a joke, her hands gesturing confidently as if nothing were wrong, as if she hadn't just humiliated a child for daring to believe she belonged in this space. Jasmine swallowed hard. Her eyes burned, but she blinked the tears away. She wasn't going to cry, not here, not in front of them. She was stronger than that. She had to be. Jasmine remained in the corner, motionless, her back straight and her hands folded over her folder like it was a lifeline. Time dragged, each minute stretching like elastic taut with tension. She counted the clicks of the overhead clock, each one landing like a pin drop in her ears. Her eyes scanned the room, but they never settled for long. She didn't want to appear nervous, but the discomfort was becoming unbearable. Her legs ached. Her fingers had gone cold. Still, no one came to explain why she was being detained for what should have been a routine deposit. And then she heard it. Victoria's voice again, this time softer, but not quite a whisper. "I'm telling you, we need to maintain our standards. We can't just let anyone walk in here and expect to be treated like they belong." Jasmine froze. The words cut through the marble and mahogany polish of the room like broken glass. Her throat tightened, her fingers curled into her palms. A flush of heat surged through her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from fury. It was no longer vague suspicion, no longer passive dismissal. Victoria had confirmed what Jasmine feared all along. This wasn't about policy or caution, it was about perception, prejudice, power. She wasn't being treated this way because of a check. She was being treated this way because she didn't look like someone who belonged. She wanted to move, to demand her documents, to ask for a manager above Victoria, to shout. But something in her held back. A weight settled on her chest, familiar yet foreign. She had heard stories like this, read them in school, seen them online, but she had never expected to become one of them. She glanced at the line of tellers. No one met her eyes. She looked to the security guard stationed near the entrance. He had one hand on his belt, the other resting by his side. He wasn't staring, but he wasn't not watching either. She was being observed, not as a customer, but as a potential threat. The realization made her skin prickle. She looked around again, her gaze darting from face to face. A few customers cast quick, awkward glances her way before turning back to their transactions. A couple whispered behind cupped hands. One older woman shook her head with faint disapproval. Jasmine felt each look like a pebble tossed into a pond, ripples of judgment spreading outward. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one asked if she was okay. She was alone in a room full of people, her stomach churned with the weight of it. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation, it was the confirmation. The undeniable proof that all her mother's warnings, all the quiet lessons about dignity, resilience, and the double standards she might face one day, it was all real. And it was happening, now, to her. She glanced at the clock again. Almost an hour had passed. She shifted her stance slightly, trying to ease the pressure from one foot to the other. But even that simple act drew a sharp look from Victoria, who was now pretending to review paperwork at a nearby desk. Jasmine's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Excuse me." No one responded. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder. "Excuse me, I need to contact my mother." Victoria didn't even look up. "You'll wait," she said flatly. "I've been waiting for nearly an hour," Jasmine said, her voice trembling, but louder now. "You said you needed to verify the check. Has anyone even looked at it?" Victoria's smile was thin and brittle. "I said wait. If you're in such a hurry, perhaps you should have come with an adult." The final word hung heavy in the air. An adult, as if her age invalidated her integrity, as if it proved her untrustworthiness. Jasmine felt a surge of defiance rise in her chest. She swallowed it down, but not because she was afraid, because she knew it wouldn't matter. Not here, not right now. She turned her eyes toward the lobby doors. The afternoon sun still spilled across the floor in golden slants, mocking in its warmth. She clenched her hands tighter and said nothing, but inside the burn had turned into a storm. Jasmine's mind began to sharpen through the haze of humiliation. She was no longer simply standing in silence, she was watching, observing, learning. The longer she waited, the clearer the patterns became, not just in how she was treated, but in how others were treated too. She saw the elderly white couple who entered minutes ago. Victoria had rushed to greet them with a dazzling smile, shaking their hands and ushering them toward a private telestation at the back. Jasmine could hear her voice from across the room, suddenly melodic and polished. "Please, right this way. You're our priority." Then a young man stepped up to the counter, a man with brown skin and a thick accent holding a stack of paperwork. Victoria's smile vanished, her tone turned dry, clipped. "The system's running slow today," she said, barely looking up. "It might be a while." Jasmine watched him blink in confusion, then walk away, his shoulders sagging. And then, just moments later, a white couple entered with similar paperwork. Victoria practically glided over to them, extending a hand and offering help before they even reached the counter. "Let me take care of that for you right away," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "You're in good hands here." Jasmine's breath hitched. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The script had been rewritten customer by customer based solely on appearance, and she, young, black, and alone, had been cast in the role of intruder. Her hands clenched at her sides. She stared down at her school shoes scuffed slightly at the toes and wondered what about her appearance could possibly justify this treatment. She had done everything right. She was polite. She was prepared. She was qualified. And still she was being treated like a criminal. Her mother's voice echoed in her head again, not the gentle voice from breakfast this morning, but the voice from one of their late-night talks. "There will be days when your dignity is tested, not because of your actions, but because of how the world chooses to see you. On those days you must remember who you are before they tell you who they think you are." Jasmine drew in a breath, slow and deep, holding that mantra like a shield. But then the next blow came. Victoria turned to the security guard near the exit and without subtlety pointed toward Jasmine. "Keep an eye on her," she said. "Make sure she doesn't try to leave." The room didn't fall silent, but it felt like it did in Jasmine's ears. Her face flushed. She could feel the heat rising up her neck, the pulsing thrum of disbelief in her chest. Keep an eye on her, as if she were going to steal something, as if she was a flight risk. She had come to deposit money, not rob the bank. The guard, a large man with a flat expression, gave a slight nod. He adjusted his stance. folded his arms, and began watching her more closely. Jasmine blinked against the sting in her eyes. This was no longer quiet bias, no longer subtle microaggressions or coded language. This was surveillance. This was intimidation. This was institutional power being used to remind her that she didn't belong. She inhaled again, slow and deliberate, but this time it hurt. Everything inside her screamed for justice, for someone to say this wasn't okay, to step forward to make it stop. But no one did. The other customers whispered behind their hands. Some avoided eye contact. One woman looked directly at Jasmine, then turned away with a sigh, as if Jasmine had brought this on herself. The loneliness hit her like a wave, and still Victoria didn't look her way. She returned to her desk, sipping from a porcelain mug, like nothing had happened, like none of this was extraordinary. Jasmine glanced back at the teller counter, now being cleaned and reset for the next guest. Her folder still sat on the ledge untouched. This wasn't about verification, this was about punishment. And she knew it now with absolute clarity. No matter how perfectly she performed, no matter how thoroughly she prepared, to some people, her very presence would always be seen as a threat. And yet she refused to crumble. She gripped her folder tighter, lifted her chin just a bit higher, and stared straight ahead. She wouldn't beg for respect. She would command it with her silence, and wait for now. The longer Jasmine stood in that corner, the more her legs stiffened and her back ached, but she refused to let her posture falter. Each breath she took was measured, each blink deliberate. She didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break, not Victoria, not the guard, not the strangers whispering behind manicured fingers. But inside she was unraveling thread by thread. The silence around her wasn't complete. It was pierced by quiet conversations, the soft shuffling of feet, the distant clicking of keyboards, but it was the silence toward her that felt deafening. No questions, no reassurances, no kindness, as though she were a stain on the polished marble floor, better ignored than addressed. She glanced again at the security guard. He hadn't moved, but his presence loomed like a shadow stretched across her confidence. Every time she shifted even slightly, she saw his eyes flick her way. His posture was stiff, his gaze indifferent but constant, like she was a locked door waiting to be forced open. She wasn't a criminal. She was a 14-year-old girl with a scholarship, a child, but clearly none of that mattered here. Her thoughts turned bitter as she remembered the hopeful energy she'd carried into the bank just an hour ago, the sense of pride in her stride, the quiet joy of knowing she'd earned this money with her own effort. She had imagined the transaction going smoothly. A signature, a polite nod, maybe a congratulatory smile, then back home, simple. Instead, she'd been rendered invisible by everyone except the people who saw her as a potential problem. Her stomach twisted. Then something new stirred in the air, a change in tone, a new conversation. It came from the corner of the lobby where Victoria now stood, speaking with Tom again. Their voices were lowered this time, but Jasmine was close enough to catch fragments. "She's still here." Victoria muttered, her frustration unmistakable. "Well, yeah. You said you wanted to." Tom's voice wavered. Victoria cut him off. "We need to get rid of her. Make sure she knows she's not welcome here." Jasmine's pulse surged. Her breath caught mid-inhale as though her lungs had suddenly forgotten how to work. It didn't matter that they were whispering. It didn't matter that no one else seemed to hear. She heard, and that was enough. So that was the plan all along, not to verify, not to process, but to discard. To wear her down with silence and scrutiny until she either broke or walked away in shame. But she wouldn't walk away. Not anymore. "I'm not a problem," she said suddenly, her voice loud and clear across the lobby. Everyone turned to look startled by the interruption. "I'm not a threat. I'm not someone who needs to be gotten rid of. I'm a student. I earned this scholarship and I came here to deposit it just like anyone else." There was a beat of silence, so thick it could be touched. Victoria turned sharply, her face hardening. "Young lady, I suggest you lower your voice." "I will not." Jasmine interrupted, her voice trembling but strong. "You've treated me like I don't belong here. But I do, and whether or not you think I look like someone who deserves respect, I am someone who does." The guard took a step forward, and Jasmine instinctively stepped back. But she didn't cower. She stood. Tom looked deeply uncomfortable now, his eyes darting between the manager and the girl, clearly unsure where to place his loyalty. The other customers were quiet now, watching, listening, Jasmine could feel the flush of emotion rising up her neck, her cheeks burning, but she kept her voice even. I have the paperwork. I have the scholarship letter. I did everything right, and yet I've been humiliated in front of all these people. Victoria didn't respond. She simply looked away. But Jasmine didn't stop. She turned slightly, addressing the room, now not just the people behind the counter, but everyone. If any one of you had been treated this way, ignored, watched, dismissed, you'd speak up too. So I'm speaking up, because I won't be silent just to make someone else comfortable. A murmur rippled through the lobby. People shifted, eyebrows rose, eyes softened. No one had expected her to fight back, and no one could unhear what she had just said. The guard paused, uncertain now. Jasmine stood her ground, not as a scared teenager, but as someone who had every right to be there, every single right. The silence that followed Jasmine's declaration hung heavy in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. The bank, once a symphony of casual chatter and transactional murmurs, had become a stage, every gaze fixed on the 14-year-old girl who dared to speak truth in a place built on quiet compliance. Victoria Hayes's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a line so tight it could have cut glass. For a moment it looked like she might lash out with another cutting remark, another command designed to reassert dominance. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the weight of the room's sudden attention. Maybe it was the realization that the narrative she'd constructed of control superiority and silent compliance was unraveling right in front of her. Instead, she turned to the security guard. Take her to the back, Victoria ordered, her voice tight with restrained fury. Keep her there until we finish with the paperwork. The guard hesitated. Jasmine's heart skipped. She had expected many things, anger, denial, even lies, but not this. Not an order that made her feel like she was being detained rather than served. I haven't done anything wrong, Jasmine said, her voice sharp with disbelief. The guard approached. He didn't speak. He didn't question. He simply followed instructions. His large hand wrapped around Jasmine's upper arm, not painfully but firmly enough to send a clear message. You don't get a choice. The shock rippled through her. Gasps echoed from a few corners of the bank. A woman near the window muttered, "That's a child," but did nothing more. Just like everyone else, Jasmine was marched across the polished marble floor, her loafers clicking softly against the hard surface. Heads turned to follow her. Some eyes were wide with surprise, others filled with pity. But no one stopped it. The humiliation was suffocating. She was placed in a corner near the back, visible but far enough to be removed from everyone. Isolated like a display, a warning. Stand here, the guard instructed, his tone low and detached. She didn't move, didn't nod. She just stood, her chest tight, her eyes burning, her spirit frayed but unbroken. As the guard stepped back, she tried to steady her breathing. The flood of emotions inside her was nearly too much to contain: rage, hurt, disbelief. But it was the disbelief that stung most. Because for the first time in her young life, Jasmine saw what it truly meant to be treated as less than not. Because of anything she did, but because of who she was. Because of what she looked like. She had been warned by her mother, of course, taught the language of quiet injustice, the ways that bias could be camouflaged behind policy politeness or procedure. But nothing could have prepared her for the real thing, for being shuffled like an object, handled like a liability, discarded like clutter. And still, no apology, no explanation, no sense that anyone in this bank believed she deserved better. From where she stood, she could see the bank's inner workings. The VIP rooms, the polished desks, the warmth shown to those who arrived with privilege painted on their skin or stitched into their clothes. She saw how different her experience had been, not by accident, but by design. Victoria moved through the space like nothing had happened, her heels clicking against the marble, her eyes avoiding Jasmine altogether. But Jasmine kept watching, because now her silence wasn't fear, it was strategy. She was absorbing everything. Memorizing faces, words, moments. She wouldn't forget. She couldn't. Then out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something new. Victoria was speaking to a man, a tall, confident figure in an expensive grey suit. He wasn't a customer. He moved with the familiarity of someone who belonged. But Jasmine didn't recognize him. Not at first. Then it clicked. She had heard his name before. In business conversations at home, mentioned offhand by her mother, Harrison Wells. CEO of Meridian Banking Group, one of the largest competitors to her mother's financial firm, the one with a reputation for playing dirty behind a polished smile. Victoria leaned in toward him, lowering her voice as she handed him a folder stamped with "Confidential" in bold red letters. Jasmine's breath caught. Something was happening, something bigger than her. And suddenly the story shifted. The discrimination wasn't the whole story anymore. It was the cover, and Jasmine had just stumbled into the center of something far more dangerous. Jasmine's pulse thudded in her ears as she watched Victoria and Harrison Wells continue their quiet, calculated exchange. Every movement between them seemed loaded with meaning, small glances, sharp nods, the subtle lean of bodies trying not to be seen yet operating in plain sight. The manila folder passed between their hands was more than just paper. It was a signal, a betrayal. Jasmine squinted, trying to make out what was inside. She couldn't read the pages, but she saw enough financial documents, internal memos, signatures, materials that had no business being in the hands of a rival CEO. She didn't know every detail, but she didn't need to. Her instincts told her the truth. Victoria wasn't just discriminating against her for how she looked, she was helping undermine the very company Jasmine's mother had built. Her stomach twisted. The audacity, the cruelty, the timing. Was this why she'd been treated with such contempt? Because Victoria recognized her? Because Jasmine was Naomi Porter's daughter? Did this humiliation have nothing to do with her scholarship check at all, but everything to do with silencing a threat? Jasmine's hands trembled, but she didn't let the folder she held slip. She turned slightly, putting her body between herself and the bank staff, and reached for the small leather-bound notebook tucked into her blazer pocket. Her mother had given it to her last year. To record your ideas, Naomi had said, or anything the world might try to erase. Now it had a different purpose. With one hand shielding the pages, Jasmine began to write, her handwriting quick and tight. Victoria Hayes, seen giving confidential folder to Harrison Wells, CEO of Meridian Group. Time 3:41 p.m. Folder marked confidential. Victoria whispering. Looked nervous. He looked pleased. She kept writing, every gesture, every word she could pick up. She noted Wells's sharp suit, the golden cufflinks, the firm handshake they exchanged before he turned to leave. She tracked the direction he exited the car. He climbed into black BMW license plate partially visible. Every detail might matter. Because this wasn't just about a racist bank manager anymore. It was about corruption, sabotage. And Jasmine had witnessed it. As Wells disappeared out the glass doors, Victoria turned and their eyes met. For a brief second, the air between them froze. Victoria's smile faded, her steps slowed. She tilted her head just slightly, reading Jasmine's posture, her expression, the notebook she clutched to her chest. She knew, and Jasmine knew she knew. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Victoria's mouth tightened into a hard line, and she pivoted sharply, walking briskly back to her station behind the counter. No words were exchanged, but a new tension crackled through the room. Jasmine could feel it like static. The power dynamic had shifted just a little, but enough to rattle the illusion of control Victoria had been clinging to all day. Still, the pressure in Jasmine's chest didn't let up. What now? She had no proof. No recording, just her observations and the contents of a notebook. But somehow she knew what she'd witnessed would matter, because her mother didn't run just any financial firm. She ran one built on trust, on confidentiality, on clients who would abandon ship at the first whiff of internal betrayal, and Victoria had just risked all of it. Jasmine looked down at her notes, reading over the lines she had written, forcing herself to stay calm. She hadn't cried. She hadn't run. She hadn't let them reduce her to the stereotype they expected. She had watched. She had documented. And now she had a decision to make. Should she wait? Should she speak? Her heart screamed for her mother to call her, to beg her to come, but her phone was still locked away in her school locker. All she had was time, pain, and the truth. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes truth was the most powerful weapon in the room. As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine didn't move. She stood straighter, her notebook pressed firmly against her chest, her expression steeled. Because the moment Victoria handed over that folder, she wasn't just the victim of discrimination anymore. She was a witness. A threat. And she wasn't going to be silent. Not anymore. Jasmine's feet ached, and her back throbbed from hours of enforced stillness, but she didn't dare shift her position. Every inch of her posture now served a purpose. Defiance, awareness, control. She had been treated like a suspect, ignored like a stranger, and shuffled like an inconvenience. But she was still there. She had endured every insult disguised as procedure, and now she had the upper hand. She clutched the notebook to her chest like it was a shield. But it wasn't just protection, it was proof. The scribbled timeline, the descriptions of Victoria's behavior, and the exchange with Harrison Wells were more than just memories. They were testimony. She took another look at the lobby. Business resumed, but it was no longer normal. A few people glanced at her with the discomfort of those who had witnessed injustice and chosen silence. Some looked away quickly. Others held her gaze for a second longer. No words, no apologies, just the heavy tension of realization. Something had shifted. Victoria hadn't come near her since Wells left, but Jasmine could feel her eyes watching, calculating. It wasn't just irritation anymore. It was fear. Good. She turned her gaze to the bank doors, half hoping to see a familiar figure walk in. And as if summoned by thought, the doors parted. And there she was. Naomi Porter. Jasmine's breath caught. Her mother's entrance was quiet but commanding. She didn't stride in angrily. She didn't raise her voice or make a scene. But her presence was unmistakable, impeccably dressed eyes, focused every step, poised. She scanned the room once and locked onto her daughter still standing near the back. Her posture stiff, her eyes tired but alert. In an instant, her expression changed. Jasmine saw it, a flicker of disbelief, then fury, and then something far more dangerous, control. Naomi's anger never exploded. It crystallized. Victoria straightened the moment she saw Naomi smoothing her blazer and stepping forward with a brittle smile. "Miss Porter, I wasn't expecting you today. How can I assist you?" Naomi didn't waste a second. She walked straight to Jasmine, ignoring the manager completely. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low but edged with concern. Jasmine gave a small nod. "I'm fine," she said, "but there's something you need to see." She handed her mother the notebook. Naomi flipped it open with practiced precision, scanning line after line as Jasmine quietly recounted everything: how she'd been singled out, dismissed, detained, and then most importantly, what she saw: the confidential folder. The man it was handed to, the name on the documents, the intent behind the exchange. Victoria hovered nearby, shifting nervously. Naomi's eyes never left the notebook. When Jasmine finished, her mother closed it softly, like someone sealing away a secret that could burn through walls. Then slowly she turned to Victoria. "Miss Hayes," Naomi began, her voice cool as steel, "you owe my daughter an apology. And you owe me an explanation." Victoria's professional mask began to crumble. I don't know what this is about. There's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding." Naomi's tone didn't rise, but it sliced through the air with quiet finality. "There's no misunderstanding. You've not only humiliated a child who came here with integrity and documentation, you've shared confidential material with one of my direct competitors. That is corporate espionage. And it is a crime." Silence. Even the clicking keyboards at the teller windows had gone still. Victoria's face turned ashen. This isn't— "You're fired, Miss Hayes," Naomi said, cutting her off. "Effective immediately." The room held its breath. Security was called. The same guard who had once escorted Jasmine to the corner now approached Victoria, his posture uncertain. "Please escort Miss Hayes out," Naomi instructed. Her tone was composed. Her eyes never left the woman who had tried to break her daughter. Victoria didn't protest. She couldn't. There was no room left to twist the narrative. As she was led away, her heels scraping across the once triumphant marble floor, Jasmine felt something deep within her loosen. The weight, the shame, the injustice. It didn't disappear, but it cracked. Her mother turned to the lobby, addressing the stunned onlookers with quiet authority. "This institution will undergo a full review," she said. "Procedures will be changed, and no one will ever be treated the way my daughter was today. Not here, not again." Jasmine looked at her mother, awe blooming behind her exhaustion. She hadn't just shown up. She had transformed the room, and Jasmine had never felt more proud. The tension that had gripped the bank began to dissolve, replaced by an electric stillness, like the room itself was recalibrating. Naomi Porter stood tall in the center of the lobby, her presence anchoring every eye, every thought. Even those who had previously whispered or looked away now found themselves standing straighter, perhaps unsure whether they were witnessing a reckoning or a miracle. Victoria Hayes was gone, escorted out not just as a disgraced manager, but as the symbol of a rotting system finally being excised. Jasmine slowly exhaled. For the first time that day, she felt her shoulders truly relax. Naomi turned to her daughter. "Come with me," she said gently, and led her to the counter where the nightmare had begun. The same spot where Tom the young teller still stood, his face pale, his posture frozen somewhere between guilt and dread. Naomi's voice was calm but unmistakable. "Do you still have my daughter's documents?" He nodded quickly, almost tripping over himself to gather the folder and check. "Yes, ma'am. Everything is here. I didn't know. You knew enough to participate," Naomi said, "but you'll have a chance to correct that." Tom blinked, then handed over the folder. Naomi passed it to Jasmine. "Do you still want to deposit the check?" she asked. Jasmine hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to take it and walk out, leaving the bank with the satisfaction of reclaiming her dignity and nothing more. But she didn't. She stepped forward, standing tall beside her mother, and placed the check on the counter herself. "Yes," she said. "I came here to make a deposit. I'm still going to." Tom nodded hurriedly and processed it without a word. And this time, when Jasmine signed the slip and handed it back, she felt something shift inside her, not just a sense of victory, but a deeper, more sobering realization of the power she carried when she stood firm. As they turned to leave, Naomi paused and addressed the entire room once more. "This bank is under new leadership, and with it comes new standards. Discrimination, covert or overt, will no longer be tolerated. Fairness is not optional, it is policy." A murmur of assent moved through the lobby. Some clapped, others bowed their heads. And as Jasmine and her mother stepped into the afternoon sun outside, the day somehow felt brighter than when it had started. But that wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, a full investigation unfolded. What Jasmine had recorded in her notebook turned out to be the key to unraveling a quiet sabotage network within the bank. Confidential documents funneled to competitors, customer data mishandled, and decisions made through the filter of unconscious bias. Naomi worked with the bank's board to implement sweeping reforms, equity training, new hiring practices, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. And Jasmine, she became more than just the girl with the scholarship check. She became a voice. She was invited to speak at Westridge Academy, where students listened wide-eyed as she recounted her story, not to shame but to inspire. She didn't ask for pity. She called for awareness, for courage, for conviction. "I didn't speak up because I thought I was brave," she told them. "I spoke up because silence had become too heavy to carry." Her words rippled beyond the school. News outlets caught wind of the story. Her speech was shared across social media. And with it, a quiet revolution began, led not by outrage, but by clarity. And Jasmine, still just 14, became the kind of leader her mother had always hoped she'd be, composed, powerful, and principled. She had walked into that bank as a girl, hoping to be seen. She walked out as a young woman who would never again be invisible. Months passed and life resumed its rhythm, but Jasmine had changed. She carried herself differently now, with a quiet assurance that didn't seek validation, but radiated truth. The experience at the bank had left a mark, not a scar, but a signature. Proof that when pushed to the edge of silence, she had chosen to speak. The bank, now operating under revised leadership, had transformed. The woman who had once stood invisible in its marble halls now stood as the catalyst for its rebirth. And while Jasmine never sought credit, her story had become something greater than her own. It had become a reminder to institutions, to communities, to everyone, that no one is too young, too quiet, or too underestimated to demand respect. At home, Naomi still reminded her to study, still teased her about curfews, still poured coffee like nothing had changed. But sometimes when they sat at the breakfast table, Jasmine would catch her mother watching her with quiet pride, like she was seeing the future she'd worked so hard to create, now sitting across from her, real and rising. Jasmine had always believed in fairness, in hard work, in her place in the world. Now she believed in her power to defend it. and no one would ever make her feel small again.